Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Inshallah, today we're going to continue with the tafsir. So let's look at it really quick. We were doing Ja'alallahu al-Ka'bata al-Bayt al-Harama qiyaman lin-nas. And we went in details with what it means, Ja'alallahu al-Ka'ba. We talked about why it's called al-Ka'ba. And we said one opinion is because it is cubic. The second opinion is that because it has a ceiling, it has walls. The third opinion is that it basically is considered as a destination or a place where people are supposed to turn or face, or their orientation. Al-Bayt al-Haram, it's called Al-Bayt, which means house. Al-Haram means sacred. In other words, there are specific things that you are not supposed to approach while you are within the premise of Al-Kaaba, and the premise that surrounds Al-Kaaba is also considered Al-Bayt al-Haram, even though it's outside of the cubic area. So we're looking at the premise that would be considered an area that arguing is haram, killing, hunting, cutting down trees is haram. So we're looking at trying to maintain the sanctity of this holy site, to be focused, and whoever is there to stay focused on ibadah, to stay focused on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that would be the key thing to do. Qiyaman lin-nas. So qiyaman actually means as something, one, to give support, two, to basically let people contribute towards their akhirah, whether we're speaking about heading towards Mecca and Kaaba to resemble Tawheed, to resemble the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and certainly the legislature that comes from basically the Wahy would basically come in as the supporting legislation in order to bring about justice, to bring about security, to bring about whatever that results in bringing a society towards civilization / al-Khilafah. When we're speaking about al-Khilafah, this does not necessarily mean al-Khilafah, meaning the ruling of a Khalifa per se, but this would be that you're ruling by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala regardless of the lineage of the Khalifa. Why are we talking about the lineage of the Khalifa here? Because most scholars actually considered, in fact, not only most scholars, but pretty much majority of the scholars, they actually considered that the Khalifa, in order for him to be a Khalifa, that he has to be from al-Bayt, from the house of the Prophet ﷺ. But we know that throughout history, we didn't necessarily have all the Khalifas be necessarily coming from the lineage of the Prophet ﷺ, but that doesn't mean that that's our evidence, okay? That doesn't mean that that's our evidence, but we're talking about what really matters is ruling by the legislation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not necessarily the lineage of the person that is ruling. And the Shahr al-Haram, basically certain months, they were considered as holy months, and that was to pave an area of security, time of security for the people to go to Mecca, do their Hajj, in and out, basically at peace and not fearing any form of probably maybe pirates, maybe other people harming them, etc. So it was completely forbidden to attack or kill anyone within not only the premise of Mecca, but even within the Arabian Peninsula. That was a custom that they had practiced within those 4 months of Al-Ashhur al-Hurum. Does Islam and did Islam necessarily consider those Al-Ashhur al-Hurum? So Islam did consider that it is not permissible to fight not only within those months, but throughout the year. but considered that fighting for justice, whether it was during these months or whether it was outside of these months, that's what was considered as the objective that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had ordered us to do. So considering the months per se wasn't necessarily the area of sanctity, but the area of sanctity was the principle and the foundation. Al-Hadiya wal-Qala'id, where we went in details in regards to al-Hadi, that they would take their own, basically al-An'am, we're talking about goats, sheep, cow, and camels. They would drive them along in order to present them during Hajj or during Umrah for certain kinds of Hajj practices. So that's a different story. But there were certain customs that the Quran and the Sunnah had approved that they would do. So certain practices, as probably slitting the back of a certain let's say the camel's hump, or perhaps maybe putting some certain ornaments around the animals in order to show that this is designated for hadi, etc. So that was a practice that the Prophet himself had done, and Sayyidah Aisha, in fact, herself had said that she had prepared the ornaments for certain hadi that was basically designated for Hajj. لِتَعْلَمُوا أَنَّ اللَّهَ يَعْلَمُ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ, in order for us to know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what is in the heavens and what is on the earth. But I want to look at one thing. When you look at the word ma, it's completely different than the word man. So you know that there are certain ayat that would say, أو أن الله يعلم من في السماوات ومن في الأرض. So what's the difference? So this ma would be considered for something that is not capable of having intellect. So it is more comprehensive. It would include things that are capable of having some form of processing intellectual things, understanding, knowing, etc. And the ma, or the things that are, it's called aql and غير العاقل. غير العاقل would be of things that are not capable of processing thoughts, not processing intelligence, any form or any being that is not capable of processing ideas is considered غير العاقل. So you could see the word ma is more comprehensive. But when you look at ما في السماوات وما في الأرض, because it is ما في السماوات وما في الأرض, this is basically telling us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala right there telling us that He knows whether we're speaking about things that do think and process ideas or things that don't process ideas, that they are basically under the knowledge of the Lord Almighty. And the knowledge of the Lord Almighty basically is capable of reaching beyond their knowledge. But we do already know that some ayat are saying يَعْلَمُ مَنْ فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ. Is that an indicative of the existence of aliens? The answer is possibly. Okay, possibly. And in fact, when we say possibly, it basically is within the area of most likely. Because when you say man fi samawati, and of course this is in a number of different ayat in the Quran telling us that man fi ya'lamu man fi samawati or man fil ard, that yes, it would also be indicating that there are creatures that are capable of processing ideas. Well, why can't we say that this is referring to the angels? Because the angels are not thinking creatures. They just do what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells them to do, and which is why you would see in Surah al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He told the malaika, إِذْ قَالَ رَبُّكَ لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً. And they just said أتجعل فيها من يفسد فيها ويسفك الدماء ونحن نسبح بحمدك ونقدس لك قال إني أعلم ما لا تعلمون. And then علم آدم الأسماء كلها ثم عرضهم على الملائكة فقال أنبئوني بأسماء هؤلاء. It was very obvious in the ayat that the malaika weren't capable of processing thoughts. They, yes, did question, they did, and of course, if you question something, the questioning is not necessarily an indicative of you having knowledge, but you are having some type of awareness, but you're not capable of necessarily processing ideas. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was showing them that this new creature, Adam alayhi salam, the human being, is capable of doing things that the other creatures were not capable of doing, whether we're speaking about malaika or whether we're speaking about jinn or whether netradals or whatever it is that was existent before Adam alayhi salam. And when they saw Adam, they basically had correlated this new creature to probably previous creatures. And they thought, well, is this creature, is it going to cause the same destruction that the other creatures had caused? Or what? How do we understand this new creature? So the Lord Almighty presented Adam alayhi salam after he had taught him the names of things, etc. In other words, now showing signs of intellect. Okay. Now, when Adam alayhi salam showed signs of intellect, that's when the angels knew that this new creature is capable of doing what they are not capable of doing. Okay, which is intellect, which is al-aql, which is processing ideas, which is also having free will. Okay, angels don't have free will. They just do as they are told to do. They don't have free will. How is it that you don't have free will? Well, just as the sun, as different plants, as different creatures, they don't have free will to decide to probably, I don't want to be a mountain, or I don't want to rotate today. I just don't feel like it. Let's say the sun. I just don't feel like rotating today. It would just do as it was designed and as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically designed its structure and what it's supposed to do. Okay, so when you look at man fi samawati wa man fil ard, certainly this is an indicative that there are, let's call them intellectual, and I don't mean by intellectual meaning that they're smart, but I'm talking about that they're capable of processing intelligence, they're capable of understanding, etc. So should we reach out to these people? Make da'wah possibly and start having, I don't know, some booths just for the UFOs to tell them about Islam, etc. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذِّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not punish any nation until they would get prophets and messengers. So you don't have to worry about giving da'wah to the UFOs because that's something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takaffala bihi. Your duty is basically on earth. Don't worry about the UFOs getting da'wah. And I know probably if Khadija was here, she would be like, okay, we got to work out our own booth for to send messages to the UFOs and make sure that they're getting the information. Okay, so that's enough about UFOs. وَأَنَّ اللَّهَ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ عَلِيمٍ, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is aware of بكل شيء. So بكل شيء would be a comprehensive word meaning everything, whether the things that require intelligence or the things that don't require intelligence, which basically is to encompass something in knowledge, to encompass. It is really simple, similar to ayat al-Kursi. Remember ayat al-Kursi, when you look at it, it basically emphasizes the knowledge about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, well, the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and letting us know the comprehensiveness and the vastness of the Lord Almighty. So you could see in the ayat, you could see in ayat al-Kursi, Allahu la ilaha illa huwa al-hayyul qayyum. that the Lord Almighty is al-Hayy. He is basically the eternal one, al-Qayyum. His existence does not depend on others. لا تأخذه سنة ولا نوم. There's no weakness, no sleep overcomes him. Nothing overcomes the Lord Almighty. له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض. Now this is taking us into another stage. The first portion of it was telling us that the Lord Almighty himself, his existence doesn't depend on others. He is eternal. In other words, he never dies. And that's to let you know that the foundation of what defines God is that if you want to say that anything is God, it has to have, it was supposed to have brought life. And in order for it to continue its existence, it must not depend on others. Okay? In other words, it should not lose energy. If it loses energy, that means it ceases to be God. له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض. It should also have the encompassment over everything that is in existence. Whether we're speaking about the heavens, the skies, the atmosphere, the universe, the galaxy, whatever it is, the Milky Way, and what is even beyond that, that should be controlled by the Lord and what defines the Lord. له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض, and everything that is on earth. And why? Well, because what is in the skies and all that that's out there and all that that's on earth, it's basically related to one another. And that basically tells us that you cannot have multiple gods, because the second that you would have multiple gods, you would have to have that separation between the different creatures, because every single God would create his own creatures then. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you now that you recognize that everything is within a certain cycle, within a certain paradigm, within a certain correlation with one another. That is to tell you there's only one God, and that this one God, in order for it to be God, it must be eternal. It must be dependent only on itself and not depend on others. It must encompass beyond the heavens and the earth. And له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض من ذا الذي يشفع عنده إلا بإذنه يعلم ما بين أيديهم وما خلفهم. It must also have all the knowledge that basically encompasses every materialistic and non-materialistic living thing, because that would mean that this God would be beyond all. Okay? له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض من ذا الذي يشفع عنده إلا بإذنه يعلم ما بين أيديهم وما خلفهم. He would know what is the past and what is the future. In other words, we're speaking about time now, that this God must be beyond not only the place, the heavens and the earth, but must also be beyond time. Beyond time meaning both the past and the future are supposed to be within the limits of the same knowledge, because the Lord Almighty surpasses all. يعلم ما بين أيديهم وما خلفهم ولا يحيطون بشيء من علمه. And no one's knowledge goes beyond or surpasses or is at the expansiveness of the Lord Almighty's knowledge. So this knowledge piece of it is in order for us, when you look at Ayat al-Kursi, it's telling you about place, it's telling you about the Lord himself, and of course, then it tells you وَلَا يُحِيطُونَ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنْ عِلْمِهِ إِلَّا بِمَا شَاءَ وَسِعَ كُرْسِيُّهُ. So the ayah didn't really tell you how magnificent the Lord Almighty is, at least in his existence. But it just gave you an idea, okay? It gave you an idea to just understand how magnificent his knowledge is, how magnificent he is, because everything depends on him Almighty, and how his throne just alone, the throne itself is stretching far beyond the heavens and the earth, let alone the Lord Almighty. So that's to give us an idea which we could still not fathom. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then continues in other ayah to tell us وَأَنَّ اللَّهَ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ عَلِيمٌ, and that the Lord Almighty's knowledge is basically stretching farther than anything that is existent. So when we say بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ, meaning materialistic things, meaning things that you could see, things that you cannot see, things that you are probably classifying as thinkable creatures or non-thinkable creatures or whatever it is, at the end of the day, بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ, the dynamic of how things process, etc. اعلموا أن الله شديد العقاب. So how is that related to all of that? So since Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is aware of all the matters, then there's nowhere to run away from the principles of the Lord Almighty. If the Lord Almighty is the one that has the knowledge of how things function, why they function, the purpose is then going to be decided and determined by the Lord himself, because the purpose slash life is actually dependent on the purpose. So in other words, وَأَنَّ اللَّهَ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ عَلِيمٌ is related to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically mentioned in regards to the different legislatures. So when we're speaking about the principles, we're talking about the legislatures. That's in order for us to know that there's one and only one that has the right to determine the different rulings and has the right to determine the boundaries of what makes a principle that is a just principle and what makes an unjust principle, and what is considered ethical and what is not considered ethical, and what the purpose is, etc. So therefore, اعلموا أن الله شديد العقاب, and just know that the Lord Almighty is شديد العقاب. What is شديد العقاب? شديد العقاب meaning that his torments are magnificent. So شديد comes from شدد, which basically means to fasten and hasten something. So when you say fastening and making something شديد, making something as firm, and of course شديد العقاب, this العقاب would right there be مضاف إليه. So therefore, it's basically describing that the torment, the punishment itself would be very fastened. In other words, it would be very harsh. نسأل الله العفو والعافية. وأن الله غفور رحيم. وَأَنَّ اللَّهَ غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ, and yet the Lord Almighty is all forgiving and all merciful. I want you to look at this one where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yes, he did mention that the Lord Almighty is magnificent, is strong in his punishment, but at the same time, he would always bring about the opportunity for those that want to keep away from the punishment, that there is a possibility, there is an advantage, there is, an opportunity, not an advantage, but an opportunity to basically seek forgiveness, to basically seek the mercy of the Lord Almighty. And therefore, for those that do not submit to the orders and the principles of the Lord Almighty, they will find themselves basically facing the consequence of punishment. At the same time, for those that don't want to face the punishment and are abiding by the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if they were to repent, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ghafurun rahim. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is most forgiving and most merciful. So when you say most forgiving, what does that even mean? To forgive actually means to give up on the consequence and the punishment for the behavior that was wrongly done. Okay? So what's the difference between that and al-afu? So al-afu, the sin itself and the consequence over the sin is dismissed or are dismissed. But al-maghfirah, the sin itself is really there, but the consequence of a punishment, that's what was forgiven. So which is stronger? Al-afu is stronger than al-maghfirah. Because with al-afu, you're just assuming that the sin didn't even happen, and even the consequence, we're not going to talk about the consequence because we're just going to assume that the sin didn't even happen. Il-maghfirah, we are aware of the sin, but we're just going to let go in holding you accountable for that sin. Okay, Ar-Rahim, what is Ar-Rahim? Ar-Rahim is merciful. When you say merciful, Rahim, that is to mean that the Lord Almighty is basically having a consideration over the different things that you probably fear. And the Lord Almighty is giving you the privileges that are for your sake and basically encompassing you with the different things that bring your benefit in place. Okay, that's a rahmah. So perhaps you got sick, the Lord Almighty, when you are making dua, even if you don't make dua, probably taking away all the different things that might come at you, or probably were supposed to come at you without you realizing, but it's to protect you. And certainly, some of the things you may realize, some of the things you may not realize. How many times were you driving a car, you nearly got into an accident, but then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just a blink of an eye, and you were saved. Or perhaps your son was doing something, it's just a blink of an eye that could have been the last minute of their life. And the list goes on in so many of those situations where it was just this close to probably making you probably crippled for the rest of your life, or perhaps lost your life, or who knows what could have happened, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically protected you. ما على الرسول إلا البلاغ والله يعلم ما تبدون وما تكتمون. ما على الرسول, the word ما is اسم موصول, basically giving us that this is a comprehensive word and telling us ما على الرسول, that the main mission and the main object that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent the prophets and the messengers for, which is al-Rasul, they were only supposed to do one thing, which is al-Balagh. What is al-Balagh? So al-Balagh, the root is balagha. Let's write that down, right? Balagha. We're going to write that down. Balagha is basically the root. Okay, let's make that one really big so we could see it. Here we go. Okay, so balagha is the root, and you know what? Let's make it into some color that we could see, right? Balagha, and balagha would, okay, well, hold on, let me take you somewhere. Oh, here we go. So balagha would mean to reach, okay? To reach a place, and that's why we would say balagha, for example, the destination, and it could also mean to have some information reach someone, okay? So that's why the Prophet ﷺ said, spread the information, what you hear about the Prophet ﷺ, perhaps a person that is hearing the information it can happen, is probably more knowledgeable, more maybe even more aware or better in their abilities to perhaps derive rulings than the person that's passing on the information. Okay, and yes, you can have students that are probably going beyond the teachers. So the teacher is doing one side, which is probably informing what they have learned, but then you can have students that would surpass the teacher's levels, whether it's in the skill to teach, the skill to derive, the skill, or perhaps the intelligence to look beyond the statement that the teacher is saying. So when you look at مَا عَلَى الرَّسُولِ إِلَّا الْبَلَاغُ, so now we're adding the al right there. So that al, we said that al could be two things. We said al can be an inclusive al, which is al-istighraqiyya, and could also be specific, specifying al. So specifying, am I writing this right? Yes. Okay, so it could be the inclusive. So what is this one then? Is this the inclusive or specifying? So al-balagh, meaning that the Prophet ﷺ was supposed to be delivering the message. What message? It's basically the message, whether we're talking about the message about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or the message about legislation and the different principles that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted him to basically deliver to the people. وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ مَا تُبْدُونَ وَمَا تَكْتُمُونَ. And the Lord Almighty, again, the word يَعْلَم. So this is alim, this is يَعْلَم. What's the difference? So the difference is this وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ. The word يَعْلَم basically means that there's a continuation. وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ مَا تُبْدُونَ وَمَا تَكْتُمُونَ. So Allah Almighty basically knows, and it's a continuous thing. It never stops. ما تبدون, what you would conceal, and what you would hide. And whatever you're hiding, still the Lord Almighty knows everything. So what is the correlation between this ayah and the previous ayat? That for, of course, when you're looking at the previous ayat, it was giving you a number of different principles on what you're supposed to be doing during Hajj, what you're not supposed to be doing. Whether we were talking about inheritance, we were talking about certain rulings that the Prophet ﷺ the ayat in Surah Ma'ida were speaking of, and all the different details of probably inheritance, etc. But at the end, مَا عَلَى الرَّسُولِ إِلَّا الْبَلَاغُ. So now this ayah, whether we're speaking about inheritance in Surah Al-Nisa, or whether we're speaking about maybe in Surah Al-Talaq, the different rules there, or perhaps other rules in different ayat, at the end, this portion of this ayah, مَا عَلَى الرَّسُولِ إِلَّا الْبَلَاغُ, this is a comprehensive statement that the Prophet ﷺ's duty was just to inform you of the different things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had assigned to him to inform, whether we're speaking about legislation or whether we're speaking about tawheed, knowledge about the Lord Almighty, the purpose that preceded your existence, Jannah, Nar, all these different things. That's basically supposed to be just a duty that the Prophet and prophets were assigned to do, which is just deliver the message. And therefore, whether you had decided to embrace the message or reject the message, you then would not have the justification to say, well, I wasn't aware of it. Now, I want you to look at this ayah because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذِّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not hold any village, any group of people accountable unless they received the message. So what does it look like that they had to receive the message? Is it enough that they had heard on the news that there is a religion, which of course that the media is making it as the cause of terrorism and all of that stuff? Is that enough to know, or does it mean that they would have to know more details in order to be considered kafir? Okay, so there are two things. Number one, there is the general statement or definition of kafir. In other words, just by not being Muslim, that's a kafir. Okay, what is a kafir? A kafir is basically a person that is not Muslim. But then there is There is the other part, which is, so is every kafir going to go to hellfire? So for those that did not get the message, let's say we're talking about a remote island in, I don't know, the Philippines or whatever country, remote island, no one's capable of going there. These people are cannibals. Hey, if we were to go there, we could be in danger, etc. Who knows what's going to happen? And we weren't capable, and no one was capable of delivering the message to these people, because the last thing you want it to be was probably food. All right. But even though I do know some people actually did manage to go to these people, like Abdurrahman Green, and there are people, I don't know what they did to stay safe, but okay. But
It's amazing just to see their the videos of them going there and giving dawah
I
and
know,
subhanallah.
it's amazing. It's amazing. But let's just assume we weren't capable of getting to these people and delivering the dawah to them. Are they held accountable? First, let's talk about them. Are they held accountable? Are they even called kafir? So they're called kafir in the general statement, okay? In the general statement that it's either Muslim or kafir. But are they going to be held accountable on Judgment Day for being kafir? The answer is no. But they will be given a different test. So for the people that didn't have a message, or at least al-balagh, and that risala going into basically giving them the information, the tabligh right there, then in that situation, they would be similar to the time that was before the Prophet ﷺ. And those people, they didn't get the message. So we're looking at a time frame where there were no prophets, and a time frame, of course, they didn't even have any message whatsoever. Just give an example on Amr ibn Nufail. He really wanted to search for any scraps, any piece, any trace to getting him to know about the religion of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. So he goes to Syria, he goes to the Levant to see any information, because there were, of course, in Syria. Well, why not in Palestine? So Palestine, number one, was very remote. Syria, because of it being close to water, whether we're speaking about Syria, Lebanon, and you want to remember that it was really close to those areas that were fertile areas. So it was water, soil, and certainly you had the different civilizations, and the magnificent civilizations basically build their civilizations there because of the resources being more available than in certain places like Jordan and Palestine. Well, in Jordan, you did have certain areas that did have certain civilizations, like Petra, for example, but it was not as to the same level that you had in Syria and in Lebanon. I want you to look at this one. When we're speaking about Syria and Lebanon in particular, we're speaking about a civilization in an area. So we're looking at Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan, that even the Prophet ﷺ, look at this one, even the Prophet ﷺ, even though it was a lot easier to head east towards perhaps the Persian Empire, because the Persian Empire was already showing signs of defeat, was already showing signs of a collapsing civilization. Because remember Sasan ibn Badan, and remember that the king was assassinated, etc. But the Prophet ﷺ had insisted that they needed to head towards Palestine, towards Jordan, towards Bilad al-Sham, because that was a key place for any victory for Islam or any, and of course, we're not just talking about Islam, but we're also talking about the focus of all countries. You got Napoleon, you had Alexander the Great, you had all these different, of course, great people recognize that the area of Bilad al-Sham is key to basically controlling the world. It is in the heart of controlling the world, because it would be in this key area to controlling one, civilization, two, the ideas, three, the resources, four, basically a very a very key area in terms of the geography of it and the political importance, a very strategic area. And certainly when you look at, I know I kind of got off a little bit, but when you, how did I get here anyways? Now I got lost myself. I think I went so far away that I forgot where I was at. Why did I even mention this point? How did we get there? I think I'm so fixated on what's happening in Syria, right? That I can't get out of it. And all of that came مَعَ الرَّسُولِ إِلَّا الْبَلَاغِ. How did I get there? Oh dear. I absolutely forgot how I got from, what point was I talking about?
I think we all forgot.
Oh, there you go.
Don't feel
Exactly.
bad. Don't feel bad.
Oh, okay. I won't feel bad. Don't worry. I'm really fast in making sure I don't feel bad. Let me just continue the point about Syria since we're there. When you look at the ahadith focus a lot on Bilad al-Sham and what's going to happen in Bilad al-Sham, even towards the signs of Judgment Day. Whether we're speaking about Khilafah, or whether we're speaking about al-Mahdi, or whether we're speaking about Isa alayhi salam, or whether we're speaking about al-Malhama al-Kubra, all of that being in Bilad al-Sham. So why Bilad al-Sham? It basically is, yes, of an important strategic area. And you control Bilad al-Sham, you pretty much control the basis. And that's why even the Prophet ﷺ, even while he was on his deathbed, he was ordering Usama ibn Zayd's army would continue towards Bilad al-Sham. And, you know, even though it was probably going to be a lot easier to just head towards a collapsing country like the Persian Empire, but he was ordering them to head towards Bilad al-Sham. And when you look at that piece of it, just put that within the context of Tabligh al-Risala, I guess. Tabligh al-Risala, sometimes you have to also choose certain areas. And I wanted to use, I guess, Amr ibn Nufail. Amr ibn Nufail, that's the thing that that took me to Bilad al-Sham. Amr ibn Nufail was going to Syria in search of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, basically. Search of Allah doesn't mean physically, but this is talking about searching of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in terms of information about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because Bilad al-Sham was Mahbat al-Risalat. It was the area where the Risalat, basically the prophets and the messengers, those were the area where the main key places for the key prophets were actually sent in. We don't know exactly where Prophet Nuh was in, but we just know that Amr ibn Nufail was heading towards Bilad al-Sham because he was looking for any traces. Why am I taking you to Amr ibn Nufail? Did Amr ibn Nufail, did he actually find the information about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? The answer is no. He just invested in doing what is good, and he did put in the effort to know about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but he didn't actually get anywhere. But on Judgment Day, the Prophet ﷺ had said that he would be resurrected as a nation himself, even though he didn't really get the information. And just keep that one in mind. So at the end, now, what matters to us is that we have to, as Muslims, this is fard kifaya. What is fard kifaya? It's a communal obligation, and we have to invest and do what is needed in order to get to delivering the message, whether the nearby areas or the remote areas, or do what is needed in order to deliver the message to these people, whether it's in Africa, the Amazon, Asia, wherever it is. We have to do what is necessary to deliver the message. So, ما على الرسول إلا البلاغ. That's basically the mission that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent the prophets with. But then whoever carries the mission after the death of the prophets is basically us, the Muslims themselves. They would have to carry on that message, carry on the message, carry on the responsibility of delivering the message to all the people. وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ مَا تُبْدُونَ وَمَا تَكْتُمُونَ. This is a form of a threat. When you would say, I know what you're doing, I know what you're concealing, and I know what you're announcing. In other words, there's nowhere to hide, and the things that you are doing, you will be held accountable for it. قل لا يستوي الخبيث والطيب ولو أعجبك كثرة الخبيث فاتقوا الله يا أولي الألباب لعلكم تفلحون. قل لا يستوي الخبيث والطيب ولو أعجبك كثرة الخبيث فاتقوا الله يا أولي الألباب لعلكم تفلحون. So what does that even mean? قل لا يستوي. I want you to look at this one, because you could see that the Quran is laying out a certain number of different paradigms. And here it wanted to lay out one paradigm, which is the whole concept of considering that something is equal to something. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, لا يستوي. لا يستوي means it is not equal to it. Well, what? Al-Khabith. Al-Khabith is a general word, which is supposed to be anything that is contaminated, anything that is not good. It comes from the root khabutha. Khabutha actually means it is disgusting. Actually means it is to be ostracized. It is to be, I guess, kept away. It is, you recognize it's contaminated. That's what khabutha means. And at-tayyib basically comes from the root taba. Taba means it's something that would bring you amusement, something that you would get entertained by, something that is basically giving you peace, something that is giving you ease on the inside, etc. That's what taba is. So what is this ayah saying? قُلْ لَا يَسْتَوِي الْخَبِيثُ وَالطَّيِّبُ. Al-Khabith is not equal to something that is tayyib. Something that is contaminated is not equivalent, not equal to something that is good. So doesn't everybody already know that? Isn't that something that we would know as logical? So, well, that's why the ayah continues, وَلَوْ أَعْجَبَكَ كَثْرَةُ الْخَبِيثِ. وَلَوْ أَعْجَبَكَ, even if, this is the law, which means if, أَعْجَبَكَ, even if the kathratul khabith, the abundance of al-khabith, of the different things that are probably contaminated, the things that are probably not acceptable, things that are probably not good, just by having it common, just by having it in an abundant amount, it doesn't make it better. Okay? So we're going to get in details in terms of tafsir. But what is that paradigm really telling us? That when it comes to the foundation of what makes something as acceptable or not acceptable is not dependent on how many people approve it. So not because it is approved by a large amount of people, or not because the abundance of such an evil or contaminated, or something that is to be, I guess, something to be disgusted by, or whatever it is, just because it is more the whole idea of something being or outnumbering, it doesn't make it better. So just looking at the abundance itself is usually confused by many as, if I have a large number of it, if I have more people accepting something, then that usually is perceived by people as basically better, basically showing an indication that it is closer to probably being right, acceptable. We have to embrace people's choices, whatever it is. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will know what is evil or what is contaminated is going to continue to always be contaminated, whether people accepted it widely or whether people did not accept what is probably good. It will still maintain its status that it is good, even if people had perceived it differently. Even if, I want you to look at this one, أعجبك, that area of أعجبك or العجب, الإعجاب with something is when you're amused by it, it becomes something that, of course, we are capable of changing people's perceptions of things by making it basically in large amounts. So in order to probably convince the masses that, for example, LGBT, that it's being inclusive, that it's basically respecting people's choices, and the list goes on, they would know that the foundation of it is probably not going to be accepted by people that already had been educated that that's not how nature functions. But then if you were to put a large number of this rhetoric out there, you can recreate a narrative and you can indoctrinate the masses into embracing an idea or embracing al-khabith itself. So whether it's putting it in I guess, in large amounts of probably media advertisements and maybe the toys out there, letting them become something that they would color, something that they would probably buy. It looks like a beautiful unicorn. It's just with a rainbow. The child doesn't really understand what this stands for. And believe it or not, many parents don't even understand what this is really right now resembling. They just looks like a beautiful, colorful rainbow unicorn, really don't make much of it. But then what we don't realize is that it basically is carrying some normalization of a certain idea. And later on, of course, there is this really interesting, I think I talked about it before. It was a very interesting, it's like 3 hours and a half probably, on psychology and how Freud and the Freud family and what kind of correlations they had with changing, one, the departments of psychology, two, the different influences they had in changing culture. And it goes into, I guess, these companies and how they managed to, these companies were managing to find some help in aiding resources in psychology in order to basically sell their products. To sell their products actually means you got to convince the masses to make it amusing. It was really, I guess, astonishing, quite interesting. that I think it was Philip Morris, if I'm not mistaken, but one company was a cigarette company, and smoking wasn't common, and in fact it was perceived at the time that smoking wasn't for women and that it was for men only. So men would smoke, but the women weren't smoking. But this company wanted to seek from psychologist experts to basically help them to expand their consumers. And it was time to look at new customers. And in order to get new customers, they needed to basically publicize it, to market it on new customers. And these new customers, well, let's look into women right now being customers, because, hey, the psychologist would study how women would basically become great customers. They would like to spend, they would like to get, etc. And they don't always look at the budget. And so they reached out to certain feminist organizations, and then they called onto the media outlets that there's something magnificent that's going to happen. And then they gave these numbers of women under their skirts, and that it was supposed to be a sign of women's liberty and women's freedom, to show that they're not controlled by the men, and that they're as manly as men are, and that the cigarette, sorry, but I'm just going to say what they had portrayed it as, that the cigarette, the reason why men were smoking was because they were trying to basically make it into a symbol of a man's private part. This is very stupid, but yes. And that women were then, in order to show that they are strong, that they are powerful, that they are independent, and that it's not men that basically are the ones that are controlling them, preventing them from smoking. So it was time for the female feminist basically organizations to show that they are strong. So it was basically that company was giving these women cigarettes to strip under their garments. And then at one point, once they're given the signal to light their cigarettes, in order to basically portray it on the camera, that's basically when they're going to do it, in order to publicize it, that this is a sign of female liberty, the women's power, etc. So of course the media was then paid to market it as, well, this is a sign of a female's liberation movement. And of course, just looking at that, it was then so common to see basically the women just holding a cigarette and just smoking. And that was we're talking about the 50s, and it was so common that these women were smoking. And just an idea, of course, وَلَوْ أَعْجَبَكَ كَثْرَةُ الْخَبِيثِ, that part about, I guess, the cigarettes. This is one area of how many times the different companies, the different cultures can actually be changed and altered by whether it's experts with ill motives, or whether it's Shaitan himself, and then it becomes something that makes it prevalent. And just because it's prevalent, it doesn't necessarily make it right. فَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ يَا أُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. And of course, this is not exclusive, but this is in order to lay out a paradigm that the Quran was telling us, that just because something is becoming a common culture, a common practice, a common idea, it doesn't make it necessarily right. And therefore, warning us, فَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ يَا أُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. So have taqwa, يَا أُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. Uli means the owners of something. or the ones that possess something. So what are they possessing here? The lub is supposed to be the core. And so they're possessing cores here. So they're possessing, the core is basically the brain. This is a metaphor. So ulil albab, meaning that as if they have so many cores of mind capabilities, potentials to think and process ideas. So that's what basically is interpretation for ya ulil albab. So those that possess the ability to see beyond the surface, the ability to understand deeply. So when you're looking at understanding deeply, that's the core. لَعَلَّكُمْ تُفْلِحُونَ. In order for you, the word لَعَلَّ in لغة عربية is حرف ترجٍ. What is ترجٍ? ترجٍ is basically to tell you that this is in hope. In other words, by looking at the foundations of whether this matter, whether we're speaking about ethical or other matters, whether this is tayyib or whether this is khabith, if you're capable of classifying it in its simple form and not getting indoctrinated by how the masses are perceiving it, then that's what's going to lead to success. What leads to success is learning how to break down the items and understand it based on the reality of what it is and not the narrative and the rhetoric that is out there to change the reality of how we interpret such items. Now, this is extremely important, and that's why ilm is necessary in order to learn how to go back to the foundation of things without probably the influences of the influences coming from different rhetorics, narratives, etc., that or culture, of course, indoctrinations, all these different things can influence our perception, and without us realizing, we would then get into this area where we would be living in al-i'jab and thinking that, hey, it looks completely fine. This is looking like this is the right thing, etc. And without you realizing, you had confused al-i'jab, you had confused your own feelings with your mind and how it's processing how we understand what we're looking at. So it can happen that our feelings and our own mind can get into this confusion, and their dhann and al-hawa can get into some form of an opposition and confusion, and then certainly our own hawa can overcome our own speculation and our own mind, and our own hawa can sometimes, which is al-i'jab right there, can overcome our ability to dissect, to scrutinize, to study such matters, and then we're confused about the actual basis of whether this is supposed to be classified as khabith, evil, or whether it's supposed to be classified as tayyib. Another aiding tool is to look at the consequence of it. So yes, looking at the basis of it and the classification is definitely important, but at many times it can be murky where we're not able to classify it. So looking at لَعَلَّكُمْ تُفْلِحُونَ, looking at the matters and what they lead to, the consequence, etc. If it leads to victory, if it leads to health, if it leads to success, if it leads to justice, then that's an indication that this is supposed to be tayyib. If it leads to probably illnesses, it leads to injustice, it leads to harm, it leads to darar, etc., then that's an indication that this is khabith. And you could see that Sharia is all about really focused on bringing in one, the classification, how to determine al-khabith from al-tayyib, and at the same time recognize what and how this is to bring us to justice, this is to bring us to health, to bring us to stability, civilization, the list goes on, and that's لَعَلَّكُمْ تُفْلِحُونَ. And by the way, if you were to go back to the different philosophies on ethics, they definitely do. I mean, it depends on which philosophy you're looking at. So you're looking at, for example, Kant, who would say something similar, universal imperative and all of that, and consider that, well, if it's leading at a universal level, if it's leading to destruction, then that's a sign that this is basically in the smaller quantity of it is going to be evil. If it leads to evil, then therefore, if we were to put it as on a universal scale and a universal practice, then that's how we would prove that lying is evil, because then it would lead to mistrust and etc. And therefore, using that as a theory. There's also the other, well, I mean, there are also different theories and understanding, I guess, the basis of it. So you had John Locke have his theory, you had David Hume have his theory, and the list goes on and on. So Islam sums it all and says, well, yes, you're going to look at, it's not necessarily one side of that area, but you're going to look at the basis of it, and you're also going to look at the consequence, and at the same time, we cannot necessarily use the acceptance of the majority and the masses, because you also had other philosophies that say, well, there is no there's no subjective truth, and everything was based on absurdity. And since everything was based on absurdity, then therefore there's no such thing as considering something as ethical or not. And therefore, it's just really the masses that determine whether something is ethical or not, and considered that everything is supposed to be relative. That's pretty much the culture that we're living in today. Everything is relative, and therefore it's all about considering that there's no truth, and everything, it's just about, hey, whatever works for people is what's going to be considered as legal or not legal. If it works for people, then we should consider it legal. And if it doesn't work for people, then don't consider it legal. But at the end, there's no subjective morality. And then it's basically coming from the whole idea that there is no purpose behind creation, and therefore we don't have to consider any laws, and that religions are basically the opium that just curtails and was there to make people's lives harder, and that it's all nothing but a myth. Okay, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was right there coming to tell us, well, no, you have to start from the foundation of al-wahy. Okay, that's the foundation of knowing truth, and then going into the details. Now, ما على الرسول إلا البلاغ. Remember, يتبعون إلا الظن وما تهوى الأنفس ولقد جاءهم من ربهم الهدى. This is the foundation. ما على الرسول إلا البلاغ, meaning to give you al-wahy, and then you would have the other details, which يتبعون إلا الظن, they may confuse these foundations of how do we classify what is evil from what is good, and then that's basically leading them to confusing their life and eventually confusing the outcomes of what happens. So when you look at that, it's amazing. It's amazing. أشهد بأن محمد النبي. When you study philosophy, you would go into all these different debates on what makes the epistemology of ethics and how do we understand ethics, and they would go into all these different philosophies. But subhanAllah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just made it really easy and just tells you that this is really to be written in gold. ما على الرسول إلا البلاغ. You've got the wahi, you've got the resource, and just know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what you're concealing, what you're doing overtly or whether doing privately, etc. And at the end, just know, for those that want to speak about equality and just want to speak about, hey, it's all about, they're using the rhetoric that it's all about equality, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, well, no, you cannot consider evil practices as equal to basically justful practices and good practices. So just as these two are not equal, then therefore on Judgment Day, they cannot expect to get the equal consequence. And the one that had committed something evil is going to get a consequence that is going to be basically a punishment. And the ones to practice what is good, they're going to be getting a reward. And to expect that, no, it's all the same because everything is created in absurdity, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting you know, look at the foundation. Would you consider that being healthy is the same as being sick? Absolutely not. Would you consider that somebody doing the right practices is the same as doing the wrong practices? Absolutely not. Would you consider ugly and beautiful being the same thing? Well, just as we can see that there are these paradigms that show that things are distinctive and that things are not similar, well, that's the same thing that goes into the different paradigms. And not because it is more abundant, it doesn't make it acceptable. It does, and just because some are finding it amusing, it doesn't make it as more valuable. But at the end, it's in order for you to be capable in distinguishing right al-khabith and al-tayyib away from and apart. You would have to get into taqwa. Taqwa helps you distinguish. If a person does not practice taqwa, they will find themselves normalizing al-khubth. This is key. It can happen that a person can be Muslim, but because they're hanging out probably with the wrong people, maybe going to the wrong schools, maybe hanging out, reading the wrong resources. And I get this often, that we would get, especially the younger generation, yet just yesterday at probably 3 a.m., a girl was discussing, and she was telling me, hey, well, does Islam actually force women into marriages that they don't want, they don't consent to, and was bringing in names of scholars that actually said it was permissible and all of that. And subhanAllah, you could say, I said, where did you get this? Where did you get this from? And she mentioned some Orientalist names and all of that. And I said, dear, you're reading the wrong resources. If you really want to learn Islam, you got to go back to the Islamic resources and not go back to Orientalists that don't even have the ilm to go back to the resources. Then they would confuse their interpretation. They're confusing the masses, and you're just basically learning Islam from a kafir. You want to learn Islam, you got to go back to the right resources, or you're going to find yourself just in a whole swamp of misconceptions. And then it's not going to be just one misconception, it's going to be a whole set of misconceptions, and then you're going to be confused. And of course, in order to understand all of this, you basically have to make sure that you learn your Islam from the right resources and not get yourself in a swamp of confusions and then start discussing one at a time. And it's going to be endless. It's going to be endless because it's going to be kathratul khabith. It's going to be an abundant amount of khabith, and then you're going to basically confuse your not only resources, your judgments, you're going to confuse at the end your path, and then you're going to find yourself, oh, now I'm basically deciding to choose probably some other than Islam, etc. Well, you put yourself in a whole swamp. You're reading the wrong resources. It's important to recognize before you fall within this area, it's important to expose yourself to the right resources. Fattaqullah. We're not just talking about intellectual resources, but we're also talking about resources of people that are practicing taqwa. Because people that are not practicing taqwa in their tongues and what they're looking at in their behavior, they will have their influence. They will have their effect on you. And without you realizing, you will normalize a lot of such behaviors, and it will later on lead to not only the behavior gone wrong, but the behavior is not separate from your own understanding of things. It will later on influence your ability to distinguish from al-khabith and al-tayyib. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, فَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ يَا أُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. This is really similar. وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَيُعَلِّمْكُمُ اللَّهُ. If you really want to have ilm, if you really want to expand your ability to know and to distinguish the things that surround you, the most important thing that you need to focus on is to have taqwa. Taqwa leads you to having the basis of knowledge, having the basis of being able to distinguish al-khabith min al-tayyib, and being able to have the taqwa to do the right practice. And لعلكم تفلحون. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ya Rabbi,
I just
go
got
ahead,
a
Noor.
question. Sorry, I didn't mean to. You can make dua right after. Sorry.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah. So you're saying that there's no point in studying like Islamic studies in these secular institutions?
Yes and no. So in order to study Islam, if you really want to study Islam, you first have to go back to the right resources. Okay? But if a person is studying in, let's say a person already had the ilm based on the Islamic resources in the right institutions, and they were capable of going back to these resources, they were capable, meaning the Islamic resources, they were capable of distinguishing all that, then in that situation, they would be permitted to go to those other institutions that are probably not teaching Islam from the right resources. Why? Because they'll be capable of scrutinizing the different misconceptions, and they'll be capable of studying all those resources and really distinguishing what is a misconception, what is not. But if it's a Muslim that graduated high school, for example, did not even have the ilm and the ability to go back and study the Islamic resources and be able to dig into those resources and have the critical ability, let's say it that way, to scrutinize the Orientalist resources, then certainly don't put yourself in a slippery slope and then get confused on how you can get out of it. So certainly you shouldn't be studying in those universities unless you would have the capacity to protect yourself from the misconceptions out there. But if you don't have the capacity and you're putting yourself in a swamp of misconceptions, then you're only going to blame yourself that you put yourself in the wrong place. And if you get into all these confusions and misconceptions, which basically what you would find in a lot of these institutions, the Orientalists, I mean, depends on who, but Orientalists, they, most of them right now, especially the newer generation in Orientalists. They don't speak the Arabic. They don't know how to go back to the resources. And even if they were to go back to some resources, they misunderstand it. Arabic is a very complex language, by the way. It's a very intricate. It's very, very intricate, and you could easily confuse the pronouns, confuse the words, etc. If you don't really have deep knowledge of it, you can put yourself in the funniest mistakes and think that you were being smart. And that's what happened to a lot of Orientalists. They made the silliest and stupidest mistakes, and they thought that they were being smart. So just a note. What we'll do, inshallah, we'll end right here. We'll continue tomorrow. So, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik. Astaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. What are we going to do tomorrow? So, what we're going to do tomorrow, we're going to look at ما على رسول إلا البلاغ. الله يعلم ما تبدون وما تكتمون. We're going to get into seeing what al-Qurtubi had to say about all of these. I know we're going to get into a completely different topic. Just heads up. We're going to
and don't forget about the event tomorrow.
The event tomorrow. So what time is that at? Noura, remind me again.
It's 7 o'clock Minnesota time. So it should
So
be
that's
enough
6
time.
a.m. my time?
What?
6
No,
a.m. my time?
no. That do you want to stop the recording?
Okay, fair.
Okay. Okay.